What happened at Dover on Saturday was not a campaign stop, not a rally line, not a cable news clip designed to disappear by tomorrow. It was 6 flag-draped transfer cases, 6 families, and a president standing in silence while the first American war dead from this conflict came home. Before you think about rhetoric, strategy, or who is winning what, start there. 6 Americans are dead. Their names are capped. Cody A. Cork, Sergeant First Class Noah L. Teachins, Sergeant First Class Nicole M. Amore, Sergeant Declan J. Cody, Major Jeffrey O'Brien, and Chief Warrant Officer 3, Robert M. Marzan. They were killed in Kuwait on March 1st in what the Pentagon said was an unmanned aircraft system attack on a tactical operations center in Port Shuaiba. And that fact alone changes the emotional center of this story, because once service members start coming home through Dover, this is no longer something most Americans can treat as a distant headline. President Trump, joined by Melania Trump and senior officials, attended the dignified transfer at Dover Air Force Base. Afterward, he called the soldiers great heroes, said he was glad the country paid its respects, and described the ceremony as the sad part of war. He also said he wanted to keep U.S. deaths in the Iran war to a minimum. Those are the official images and official words. But the reason this moment matters is bigger than one ceremony. Dover forces a country to stop talking in abstractions. It turns war from maps and strike footage into the cost that families pay in full. And at almost the same moment those images were moving across American screens, another message was moving across the region in the opposite direction. CNN reported that Ali Larijani, described there as Iran's top security official, said Iran would retaliate against Trump and that the U.S. president must pay the price. That phrase is the kind of line that instantly catches fire online, but the deeper story is not the slogan. The deeper story is what that threat tells you about where this conflict is now. On day 8, according to CNN's roundup, Washington and Tehran appeared farther apart than ever, with neither side signaling any willingness to de-escalate. That is the real headline underneath all the noise. So if you strip away the panic, the chest thumping, and the viral packaging, what are the verified facts right now? 6 U.S. Armed Service members were killed in Kuwait. A dignified transfer for them was held at Dover on March 7th. Trump attended. Iran's senior leadership is publicly threatening retaliation against Trump. The U.S. military has also publicly denied Iranian claims that American soldiers were captured, calling those claims lies and deception. And across the region, the war has clearly widened beyond a simple 2-country exchange, with fresh strikes and alerts reported in Iran, Israel, Lebanon, Iraq, and several Gulf states. None of that requires exaggeration. It is serious enough on its own. The safest way to understand this story is not through the most dramatic claim on your feed. It is through the collision of 3 verified realities. First, the conflict has already produced American fatalities. Second, the rhetoric on both sides is escalating, not cooling. Third, the battlefield is no longer confined to one front. CNN reported overnight strikes and explosions in Bahrain, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, while also describing continuing U.S. and Israeli attacks inside Iran and new Israeli strikes on military targets and fuel-related sites. In other words, this is no longer a crisis you can describe honestly with one map and one sentence. That matters because misinformation thrives when events get fragmented. One clip shows Trump saluting at Dover, another shows threats from Tehran, another shows drones over Gulf cities, another shows smoke in Tehran or Beirut. People then stitch those clips together into neat stories that feel emotionally satisfying, but are not necessarily true. The fact-checked version is messier. It is not America has already won. It is not Iran has already broken the U.S. It is not peace is imminent. It is not global collapse is guaranteed in days. What we can verify is that the conflict is escalating. Regional actors are under pressure, and the political room for easy off-ramps looks narrower than it did a week ago. The Dover ceremony also changes the politics inside the United States. Until casualties arrive, leaders can talk about timelines, objectives, deterrence, and red lines in almost clinical language. Once names are attached to the loss, that language is tested. At the same time, Al Jazeera reported a Marist survey for NPR and PBS, finding that 56% of respondents opposed the conflict. So you now have the early shape of a familiar democratic tension, official confidence on one side, public unease on the other, and a casualty event that can widen that gap very quickly. There is another reason the Dover images matter. They undercut the fantasy that modern wars can be managed entirely at long distance. For years, political messaging has tried to separate military force from visible sacrifice. Precision weapons, standoff strikes, drones, cyber operations, special missions. All of it has fed the idea that a state can exert enormous pressure without paying the old recognizable price. Dover reminds voters that this illusion has limits. Even when a war begins in the language of strategy, it eventually lands in the language of funerals. Now look at the title of your video and ask what the strongest safe version of this story actually is. It is not simply Trump honors 6 fallen soldiers. That is true, but incomplete. It is not simply Iran vows revenge. That is also true, but incomplete. The real story is that the symbolic role of the commander-in-chief and the retaliatory logic of an expanding regional war have now collided in public view. Iran is trying to project 2 things at once: defiance toward Washington and strategic endurance in front of its own population and allies. When both sides harden their posture at the same time, the risk is not just more violence. The risk is fewer politically acceptable exits. That is why the wording from both sides matters less as theater than as signal. Trump said there would be no deal except unconditional surrender, according to CNN. He also posted that Iran would be hit very hard, and warned that certain areas and groups were at risk of complete destruction and certain death. On the Iranian side, Larijani's language about Trump having to pay the price was paired with vows of a decisive response to aggression from U.S. bases in the region. Those are not the words of parties preparing a face-saving pause. They are the words of actors trying to raise the cost of backing down. But rhetoric alone does not tell you what happens next. Capability, incentives, and political constraints matter more. And this is where a lot of bad content becomes dangerous, because it starts presenting speculation as destiny. The verified reporting does not support certainty about immediate regime change, imminent U.S. ground invasion, or total regional shutdown. What it does support is a picture of a conflict spreading across multiple arenas with enough uncertainty to make every new strike politically significant. When CNN says neither side is signaling willingness to de-escalate, that should not be turned into war for years is inevitable. It should be read as a warning that the next round of decisions matters even more. There is also an important regional dimension that gets lost when coverage becomes a pure Trump versus Iran drama. CNN reported that Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian apologized to neighboring Gulf countries and said Tehran would stop striking them unless their territory was used to attack Iran. Yet hours later, blasts were again reported in Bahrain, Qatar, and the UAE. That contradiction tells you how unstable the regional picture is. Even if leaders want to narrow the war rhetorically, battlefield dynamics, air defense responses, proxy actions, or disputes over launch origin can keep widening it anyway. In a conflict like this, intent and outcome do not always move together. That same instability is visible in the separate information battle. Al Jazeera reported that Larijani claimed several American soldiers had been taken prisoner, while U.S. military officials flatly denied it. Iran made the claim. The U.S. military denied it. There is no verified public evidence in the material you provided confirming captured American troops. That is exactly how a safe script should handle volatile wartime information, not by pretending uncertainty does not exist, but by naming it clearly. At minimum, it allows him to occupy the role every wartime president eventually has to occupy. Consoler-in-chief? It signals that the administration understands the symbolic gravity of the first American deaths. It also helps frame the narrative before critics define it entirely in terms of strategic failure or mission creep. But there's a limit to how much symbolism can carry. If casualties rise, if the timeline expands, or if the public sees a widening gap between stated aims and visible results, ceremonies alone will not stabilize opinion. And what does Larijani's threat accomplish? Inside Iran and across aligned networks, it projects that the country's leadership remains capable of threatening personal political consequences for the U.S. president even after major losses. It also aims to communicate that killing senior Iranian figures will not end the conflict on American terms. In other words, the threat is not just emotional, it is strategic messaging. It says Iran wants the world to believe that escalation pressure can still be imposed upward, not just absorbed downward. This is why the next phase of the story may hinge less on who speaks toughest and more on whose coalition holds together longer. Trump has to manage military risk, energy price pressure, allied nerves, and domestic expectations all at once. Iran has to manage internal legitimacy, military attrition, regional signaling, and the danger of looking weak after publicly maximal rhetoric. Israel has said it will continue striking with full force. Gulf states are dealing with the reality that even limited attacks on airports, water infrastructure, or airspace can affect daily life and economic confidence. And ordinary civilians across the region are living under the practical reality that one night of contained escalation can still mean alerts, shutdowns, and fear before dawn. That human layer matters because it is the easiest thing to erase when people get addicted to the scoreboard style of war coverage. CNN described streets in Iran as deserted, residents hiding at home or fleeing, and fear intensified by internet blackouts. It also reported mass displacement in Lebanon and fresh warnings across Gulf states. None of that makes one side morally pure or the other uniquely evil by itself. What it does mean is that the longer the conflict continues, the more civilian pressure accumulates alongside military pressure. And once that happens, the political meaning of every strike changes. A strike is no longer just a military act. It becomes a test of endurance, messaging, and coalition stability. For American viewers, the immediate emotional turning point is still Dover. That is the image that makes the conflict personal. The 6 service members were part of the 103rd Sustainment Command, based in Des Moines, according to CBS. They were not abstractions. They were logistics personnel, people whose job was to support the machinery of war, rather than dominate the headlines of it. That detail matters because it reminds people that modern conflicts do not only kill those at the cinematic center of the story. They also kill the people who keep systems running behind the scenes. And if you want a retention point that is strong without being deceptive, it is this. The question now is not whether the war is real. Dover answered that. The question is whether the first week's logic leads to containment or to normalization. Because wars often become politically durable, not when they are won, but when they become familiar. The danger for Washington is a creeping shift from "this is a shocking escalation" to "this is simply what the region looks like now." The danger for Iran is a similar normalization of punishment and attrition. Once both sides settle into that pattern, the threshold for additional risk can quietly rise. That is also why public language should be watched more carefully than viral clips. Larijani's vow that Trump must pay the price can coexist with Iranian efforts to calibrate where and how retaliation occurs. Public statements are part signal, part pressure management, part deterrence, and part domestic politics. They matter, but not because every sentence becomes action. They matter because they show how much room leaders think they have left. A responsible script also has to say what we do not know. We do not know whether either side has a viable private channel for de-escalation. We do not know how much pressure U.S. allies are applying behind the scenes. We do not know whether the current tempo of attacks can be sustained politically or militarily for the full 4 to 5 week timeline Trump has floated. We do not know whether Larijani's rhetoric reflects a near-term operational decision or a broader warning meant for deterrence. And we do not know whether the next major development will be military, diplomatic, economic, or domestic political. Those unknowns are not weaknesses in the analysis. They are the analysis. What we can say is that this conflict has moved into a more dangerous symbolic stage. When a president salutes fallen troops at Dover while a senior Iranian official publicly says that same president must pay the price, the war is no longer living only in battle reports. It is living in narrative frames that can lock leaders into harder positions. One frame says, honor the fallen by pressing on. Another says, honor dead leaders and civilians through retaliation. Those frames can become traps if they crowd out off-ramps. For YouTube-safe storytelling, that is the strongest version of the truth. The biggest risk is not one dramatic quote by itself. The biggest risk is the tightening interaction between public grief, retaliatory rhetoric, and a widening regional battlefield. That is how conflicts become harder to stop. Not because one side suddenly says one outrageous thing, but because every new loss makes moderation look weaker to the audience each leadership fears most. So where does that leave the story tonight? It leaves it in a place of genuine seriousness, but not licensed panic. The facts do not support pretending this is a minor exchange. They also do not support packaging every update as the final hour before civilization ends. 6 U.S. service members are dead. Their return at Dover has put a human face on the cost. Iran's top security official is threatening retaliation against Trump. The U.S. is denying Iranian claims about captured American troops. Regional attacks and alerts continue. Public opinion in the United States appears uneasy. And neither Washington nor Tehran is currently signaling a clean road to de-escalation. That is enough to justify close attention without exaggeration, and it is enough to understand why this particular moment feels heavier than the first headlines did. The first week of a war is usually full of claims about speed, control, and inevitability. Dover interrupts that script. It forces the country to confront the oldest reality in conflict. Strategy is argued in language, but loss arrives in silence. Watch the next 48 hours through 4 lenses. First, watch for whether the administration changes its description of the objective. If the language shifts from punishing Iran or degrading capabilities toward larger political outcomes, that usually signals a broader commitment, not a narrower one. Second, watch whether Iranian threats stay in the realm of rhetoric or are paired with a clearly attributed new strike on U.S. interests. Third, watch the Gulf. When airports, desalination infrastructure, shipping routes, or major energy sites start appearing in official updates, even without catastrophic damage, that tells you the war is pressing directly against the systems that ordinary life depends on. Fourth, watch the American domestic conversation. Casualties create scrutiny. Scrutiny creates pressure. Pressure can either force strategy to become clearer or drive leaders toward even sharper rhetoric. There's a reason the Dover image and the Larijani quote belong in the same title. One represents national mourning, the other represents retaliatory escalation. Put together, they tell you the emotional temperature of this war better than any map does. On one side, a president has to reassure families in Project Control. On the other, a senior Iranian official has to signal that the killing of Iran's top leader and other losses will not go unanswered. Those two imperatives do not naturally produce calm. They produce harder messaging, narrower political flexibility, and a greater premium on deterrence theater. But viewers should be careful not to confuse that theater with omniscience. War coverage is full of people who speak with maximum confidence precisely when the fog is thickest. The safer standard is different. Name what is confirmed. Separate verified fact from official claim. Attribute contested information. Do not turn early battlefield narratives into permanent truths. And above all, do not build a video around a promise the evidence does not support. That is how channels lose trust. And in your case, trust and policy safety have to come first. So the strongest truthful takeaway is also the simplest one. Trump's appearance at Dover marks the point where this war became unmistakably personal for the United States. Larijani's threat marks the point where Iran's retaliation messaging became unmistakably personal toward Trump. Between those two facts sits the real danger, a widening conflict in which symbolism, grief, and threats can begin driving events almost as much as battlefield logic does. If there is a way back from that edge, it will require more than stronger words. It will require one side or both to create political space for de-escalation before the next set of names makes the story even harder to contain.